Operation Overlord, the Airborne Troops, a four-part series about the paratroopers and glider soldiers of the United States, Canada, Britain, and France on June 6, 1944. Episode 1, The Training, How Men Became Airborne Soldiers. Imagine standing in the open door of a transport plane in the middle of the night. The engines roar. The wind tears at your jumpsuit. Below you lies enemy territory. You don't know exactly where you'll land. You don't know if your comrades will be near you. You don't even know if the next breath you take will be your last in the air or your first on the ground. You only know one thing. The moment your boots hit the earth, the longest day of your life begins. This is exactly what thousands of young men from 4 nations were prepared for, month after month. And their training was harder than most people today can imagine. Before the first parachutes opened over Normandy in the early hours of June 6, 1944, these soldiers had already come a long way. A way through mud and freezing rain, through sleepless nights and endless marches, through fear that they learned to push down again and again. 4 nations sent their airborne troops into that night: the Americans, the British, the Canadians, and a small but remarkable French unit. Each country had its own way of preparing its men for the impossible. Some trained in the hills of Georgia, some in the cold halls of an English manor, some in the snowstorms of the Canadian prairies, and some in secret camps in the Scottish Highlands, surrounded by men they had never met before, but would soon trust with their lives. Let's look at how ordinary young men became soldiers ready to land behind enemy lines. Part 1, the Americans, Camp Toccoa, and the spirit of the 101st and 82nd Airborne. In the hills of Georgia, in a small place called Toccoa, the road to Normandy began for many Americans. This is where the famous men of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Division trained. At the center of it all stood a mountain, Currahee, 3 miles up, 3 miles down, every day, in full gear. If you couldn't make it, you were out. The training lasted about a year. It started with basic physical conditioning, push-ups in the morning, runs before breakfast, obstacle courses that broke men down and built them up again. Then came jump school at Fort Benning. 5 weeks of repeated drills: stand up, hook up, check equipment, sound off for equipment check, stand in the door, go. The men learned to pack their own parachutes. The idea was simple. If you packed it yourself, you had no one else to blame and no one else to trust. They jumped from 250-foot towers. They jumped from old aircraft. They jumped until the act of stepping into the open air became routine. Later came the move to England. Long marches across the countryside, night exercises in the rain, practice landings on unfamiliar fields. The men learned how to set explosives, how to disable a tank with a single charge, how to fight in small groups when the radio was dead and the officer was missing. What made these men special was their character. Many were volunteers from simple backgrounds: farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Pennsylvania, students from California who had left their books behind. They were proud to belong to an elite unit that had to do more than any other. There was also a darker side to the training. Discipline was strict. Punishments were harsh. Men who failed were sent away in shame, often to regular infantry units. The pressure created a deep bond among those who stayed. They were no longer just soldiers. They were brothers in a way only shared hardship can create. Their motto became a symbol: Currahee, a Cherokee word that roughly means to stand alone. That is exactly what they would have to do on the night of the invasion. Part 2, the British, Hardwick Hall, and the birth of the Red Devils. While the Americans were sweating in Georgia, the British paratroopers were training in an old manor house in Derbyshire. Hardwick Hall was the heart of British airborne training. The British had a different tradition. Their training began with a question to every man: are you willing to jump out of a plane? Many said yes. Most of them quit later. The dropout rate in the early days was so high that the Army had to constantly recruit new volunteers just to keep the units at full strength. The actual jump training took place at Ringway near Manchester. At first, the men jumped from converted hot air balloons, a basket at 700 feet, an open hatch in the floor. No engine noise to drown out the fear, only silence and the wind. Men later said the balloon jump was worse than any aircraft jump because there was nothing to distract you from what you were about to do. Those who got through that moved on to real jumps from aircraft. Whitleys, Dakotas, Stirlings. After that came exercises in Scotland, in the Highlands, in wind and rain. The men crawled through heather, swam across icy lochs, slept in barns and forests. They learned to live off the land for days at a time. The British trained especially hard in small unit fighting, holding bridges, defending crossroads, regrouping quickly after a scattered landing. They practiced fighting in the dark with bayonets, with knives, with bare hands. Their instructors had often served in the desert or in commando raids, and they passed on hard-earned lessons. There was also a focus on glider training, something the Americans had less experience with. British soldiers learned to ride in Horsa gliders, large wooden aircraft towed by bombers. The glider crews trained for landings on tiny fields, often at night with no engine to correct a mistake. The Germans gave them a name that has stuck to this day, the Red Devils, because of the red berets they wore. It was one of the rare nicknames given by an enemy and accepted with pride by those who received it. Part 3, the Canadians, the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. The Canadians took a special path. Their battalion, the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, was still young. Formed in 1942, sent to Fort Benning in the United States, and trained there alongside the Americans. Many of the 1st Canadian paratroopers had to prove themselves twice, once as soldiers and once as Canadians in a foreign country. The American instructors were tough on everyone, but the Canadians felt extra pressure to show they belonged. By the end of the course, the American officers had nothing but respect for them. Later, the Canadians trained at Camp Shiloh in Manitoba, where the winters were so harsh that exercises pushed every man to his limits. Snowstorms that cut visibility to a few yards, temperatures that dropped well below freezing, night marches through frozen forests, where a single mistake could mean frostbite or worse. What made the Canadians stand out was their ability to adapt. They were later placed under British command and had to fit into a foreign army. They learned British tactics, British orders, British equipment. They had to relearn how to read maps in a different style, how to load British weapons, how to follow British radio procedures, and they did it without complaint. There were also smaller details that mattered. Canadian humor was famously dry, and it helped break tension during long training days. Canadian discipline was strict but less formal than the British style. Officers and enlisted men often shared more openly than in older armies, which made small units tighter when things got difficult. In the spring of 1944, they arrived in England, became part of the 6th British Airborne Division, and prepared for a mission that would turn out to be one of the toughest assignments of the entire D-Day operation. By the time they boarded their planes on the evening of June 5th, they had trained for nearly 2 years for a single night. Part 4, the French, the SAS Paratroopers in Exile. The smallest group came from France. After the defeat of 1940, their armed forces had been shattered, but some men escaped to England and joined the Free French Forces under General de Gaulle. From them grew a special unit, the French SAS Paratroopers. Most of them trained in Scotland, alongside the British Special Air Service. Their training focused on sabotage, reconnaissance, and small group combat. They learned how to blow up rail lines, how to set ambushes, how to live for weeks in occupied territory without being caught. These men often carried heavy personal stories. Many had left their families behind. Some didn't know if their loved ones were still alive. Some had escaped through Spain on foot, others by fishing boat across the channel. A few had survived German prison camps and made their way to England through underground networks. They trained in places like Auchinleck and Inverlochy, in old stone buildings tucked into the Scottish hills. They learned silent killing, demolition, and parachute jumps in conditions that would have grounded most other units. They were taught by British instructors who treated them as equals, often more so than the Free French Command, which was still rebuilding itself in exile. That is what made them a special force. Disciplined, hard, with a quiet determination that is hard to put into words. When they jumped on the night of June 6th, they were jumping toward their own homes. 4 nations, 4 training paths, 4 different ways to prepare young men for a night that would change history. What united them all was the feeling of belonging to something special. The bond formed in mud and rain and fear, the kind of bond that does not break easily. and the knowledge that a task lay ahead of them that was bigger than themselves. But training alone is not enough. These men also needed the right equipment, special weapons, special clothing, tools developed for this one night. Some of these inventions were brilliant, some were strange, and some saved lives in ways nobody had predicted. That's the focus of the next episode. If stories like this interest you, leave a subscribe so you don't miss the next part.